Okay, brilliant. Well, everybody, again, welcome. Thank you for coming through, and a big shout out and thank you to Dr. Becky Intler for getting me involved in this project. I think it's really positive what you're doing, and especially all these different sessions and different angles around talking about finance often doesn't gets overlooked. So I think I'm really honored to be part of that. So what I want to do is let me just introduce myself real briefly, talk about myself. My name is Alex Peters, aka Mechanikool. Now I'll explain the mechanical bit. The mechanical bit comes from the fact that I'm actually a professional dancer and I have been so for quite a long time. But actually my background is a couple of things. So I've worked in education as a learning mentor. I had done that for about 8.5 years. I was also a youth worker for about 4.5 years. So I was quite embedded in the educational system. Meanwhile, practicing being a practitioner of street dance, particularly popping, started off as something that was a hobby and then moved on to being something that I was doing professionally, just teaching people up and down the country, all over Europe, around the world, really, mentoring both young people and adults in street dance. Along that journey, public speaking became something that just by default I developed and started getting involved in more. So I was working in a local radio station for about 3 years. I was also an ambassador for a kids charity. So that's kind of really where the public speaking aspect of it developed. And then now I do a lot of conversations. I facilitate a lot of conversations around talking about men's mental health, youth culture, particularly things like the legacy of racism and the legacy of the social construct. These are different topics that I engaged in. So the reason why I've been involved in this topic, because we might be thinking, well, finance, what's all of this got to do with finance? Well, I guess from my perspective and the journey that I've been on, mental health has been a massive part of my journey. When I was in my late teens, I did suffer with depression, although I didn't understand that that's what was going on for me. Being the type of person that I was, I guess I was quite an inquisitive person. I was somebody that always wanted to ask why and what was going on. And so I found that I, by nature, was quite an introspective person, someone that likes to think about what I've been through. I have to write a lot of stuff down, spot patterns. And then I think as I was going on that journey for probably what I would say was self-healing, I became a lot more inquisitive and a lot more wanted to go deeper into understanding not just myself, but my friends around me, the communities, the wider communities, and all the spaces, all the workspaces that I've been in. I've always been someone that really likes to understand why people do what they do. And so I feel the relationship between what it is that I've done and what I'm bringing to the table today is this sense of introspection. So having said that now, the purpose of today's session is merely just to open up conversation about this. What is our relationship to finance? So for example, I've realized in my journey to kind of healing, in my journey to really understand who I am as a person, who I've been and why I've been the way I am, is to begin to start to connect dots. Maybe my first interactions with my parents, what did I learn from them? What did I learn from the adults around me? Music, videos, what were my aspirations? Did they change? And where was finance within all of this? So I think from that perspective, I want to invite people to come in and just really, we're going to open up this conversation and give you the space to really take it where it is you feel is appropriate to go. Bearing in mind that some of the stuff that we may be saying may be quite sensitive, it's quite personal, because this is more about introspection. So I'd like us to be very mindful about the fact that people may be sharing sensitive information, what we do with this. We're in this room together, so it's about whatever is discussed in this space, keeping this in this space. And, you know, people's experiences and perceptions are real to them. So just understanding that even though it may not make sense to yourself when you hear it, or you may not fully grasp it, just understand that this is people's personal experiences. So I just wanted to say that first. And at this point, by the way, yes, this is a recorded session. I should have said that at the very beginning. This is a recorded session. So just keep that in mind as well.
And sorry to jump in, Alex, but we can take anything out that people want to be left out. So this video won't go up if there's something that you don't want to go in it. So there's no rush to get this up. Let's just get this right.
100%. Thank you. So Off the back of that, maybe, like I said, we have the freedom to take it where we want to go. I do have a series of questions which I may throw it to kind of steer the conversation in certain directions. But I'd like to invite people to come to the space to start off with this question. What messages did you receive about money as a child? Now, what that question might mean is, what was your observations about how the attitude towards money was? So I'll give you an example. I think I'm a British-born Caribbean. One of the things that I often found is my parents were always talking about money didn't grow on trees. There was always an undertone of struggle. Although growing up, as I grew older, I began to realize that actually the way I perceived my parents struggling wasn't always necessarily the case. Actually, we weren't doing too bad considering the area we was in and who we were surrounded by. However, because of my perception and how I saw my parents maybe behave around money, gave me the impression that actually money was something which was quite a stressful thing to be thinking about. It was always attached to anxiety. If I spend that money, where's this money going to come back to? So the idea of abundance was really not within our family culture. So I guess when I put that question out, I'm talking about these sorts of things. What are people's, what messages does people receive? Anyone who wants to go first?
Okay, so I'll jump in. So I, yes to everything you've already said, Alex. And
Sure.
then additionally, not enough of it, hard to get it, gonna lose it. Certain people have it and others don't. And very kind of subtly, and you don't deserve a lot of it.
Yes,
I'll stop
absolutely.
at that. Right.
No, I love that because you said subtly, because it's funny when we sometimes start to conclude those ideas like, oh yeah, conclude the narratives that we receive. It may sound harsh and some may say, wow, did your parents really say that? But it's not necessarily that it was said in those sorts of way. It was through almost a series of behaviors over a couple of over years that concluded that. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Craig.
the nonverbal is the 90% in communication, right?
Right, right.
And so it's in the water, it's in the environment all around you.
Yes.
Shockingly enough, as I've got further along in life, it's always amazing to me to meet people who picked up the message that I deserve money. Money is my birthright. What do you mean I can't have? Oh, and it's easy to get if you know how. And that's been very daunting to me because that's the polar opposite of what I picked up in my upbringing, and which has created most of, I shouldn't say most, much of the mental, psychological, and emotional struggle and vulnerability that I'm challenged with in life. And I see it all around me in others. I'll stop at that.
No, thank you very much. That's really, really good. Is anybody here that would like to build upon that?
I'll jump in, but I want to be, you know, kind of the moderator step back, but it looks like it's a natural time. So for me, being born into a Canadian family that was really hardworking, not having had many people go to university or that kind of thing, money, we were comfortable. So I always felt things are okay, but my parents were so hardworking, but there's always this kind of separation of the type of work that they did, and they'd go into people's houses and clean up stuff. And there's this kind of status money thing. So I've got like a weird kind of, you work hard. And as soon as, like, I would go on jobs with them, as soon as the people in the, you know, whose job we were doing found out I was going to Oxford, it was like, boom, all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, you're not just cleaning up through our garbage or, you know, helping restore stuff. So it's like that for me, that's like a weird relationship where it's like money and status.
Right.
Yeah, I can unpack that a little bit later, but that's a weird one for me because I didn't even know growing up that Oxford was a university. I knew it was a dictionary, and you know, I know, and like it sounds really weird, but like being in Canada, being in a small space, you just kind of do your little next steps in your mind of like, you kind of stay there. But yeah, it was a weird thing about status, money. I had a scholarship because I didn't have the money, and that scholarship could have bought a house in Canada. So it was very, very weird, and lots of like, yeah, not sure where I could fit in with the status and yet
Yes.
having access. So it's kind of all a bit weird. So I think that still stays with me sometimes when I see money. I think like, I don't even know if I want it. Like it's a bit, I can just do my thing. So yeah, anyway, that's kind of my initial thoughts.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it's interesting because from my perspective, bearing in mind I've explained a little bit about my background and where I've come from, I also would say, as someone who is a practitioner within the street dance stroke hip hop community, because although they're separate, they are very much aligned with each other, is that there is this mindset, particularly because of the history and the nature of where these cultures come from, poverty, chaos, trying to salvage some sort of constant in this chaotic, ever-changing community. There was also an undertone that in order to be down with the culture, there was this unspoken idea that you're taking on the negative baggage of the pioneers who experienced it directly. So we're keeping it real. Keeping it real means that you're keeping it like how they may have lived, where finance wasn't necessarily a thing. And therefore, if you, as living within the culture, are starting to earn money, there's almost a suspicion that, did you sell out? Why did you earn that money? So then now you're getting another affirmation as to why you don't deserve money, as Craig was saying. Now, go on, Craig. I can see Craig, you buzzing there.
Then Alex, this is really resonating. Then there's the issue of, where do you source your money from, right? So there are legitimate and illegitimate ways.
Right.
And so part of keeping it real can be, you got your money, but did you get it through an illegitimate? So like, this is kind of that distinction between what I'll call street culture and, I don't know, I'll call it corporate culture, for lack of a different term, right? And so one might say it's the same money, but different cultures kind of put upon us that if you're going to be an insider, you need to have gotten your money that way versus this other way, right?
Yeah.
And I think for many of us, we are, again, taking this back to the theme of mental health. Our mental, emotional, and psychological healths are challenged when making these transitions where we're leaving our homeland, as I call it, our home culture, and being called into another culture. I think in some ways, this is one of the roots of seeing so much mental health challenge, say, in that transitional period from adolescence to adulthood, going to university, right? Or not going to university, going into the work world, going into different professions, right? So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I love it. And by the way, anyone here that's listening, what I will say about this is quite an introspective thing. So it may be something that you haven't thought about, and maybe as these conversations are going on, things are going on, are kind of passing through your mind. If you don't want to speak, feel free to text something in a text, and we'll make sure we read it out as a contribution, so you're not, under pressure to have to speak publicly.
Alice, can I
ahead.
also enter the invitation that use private chat, which is safe. And then, Alice, I'm sure that you can carry someone's point of view without divulging their identity, and that can enrich the discussion also.
100%, absolutely. If you send me a direct message, now I sound like I'm talking like I'm on Instagram now, but if you DM me and send me a direct message, I'll read it out anonymously. Okay, so let's move this conversation a little bit. So what would you say, what character traits do you have that you believe has had a direct impact on how you view money? Now, I'll give an example of that now. So one point where I begun to realize that how I viewed money as a young person, as a kid, impacted me as an adult was, I remember working at the time when I was working in full-time in a secondary school as a mentor, very passionate about dance. And at this point, we found a funding body who were willing to fund me taking 15 kids to LA to spend time, meet the pioneers, interview them, etc., etc. This was the first time that I'd done anything like this. And I did have people around me, but it was the first time, essentially. I remember we had to calculate how much money we would need. And we were sitting at the table and the person said, okay, so how much money do you want? And at the time, I calculated, and I know I was being very humble with it. I was £10,000, but the way I said it in the meeting was, and I couldn't even let the words come out of my mouth. And that was the first point that I realized, oh my gosh, this is ingrained in my system. And so I guess the question here is looking at what sorts of behavior types do you have? And the reason why I use that example is because I realized that I never really had a good experience growing up of the mindset of ask and you shall receive. Asking something was always greeted with a sense of, but then if you answer that, this is going to happen. There's always a sense of anxiety attached to it. So I always associated asking with bothering people, putting people out. I don't deserve it. And so I'm always trying to minimize what I felt I need. And that really reflected in the way I looked at money. So I guess for anybody else, and welcome Glenn, by the way, by anybody else, has anyone got anything to share on that?
So I'm sorry I'm talking so much, Becky
No,
and Alex.
it's great. I love
but it's
it.
because others are not.
I love it. I love it.
But I have to tell you, Alex, that's making me emotional, man.
Wow.
I mean, I'm 57 years old, and you have just stated the most obvious kind of hidden in plain sight insight that when you say it, I can now see so how much of my life has been affected by that hidden assumption and hesitancy. I also recognize that in some ways, this is the legacies that we're born with. We talk about that nonverbal, subtle education that we get through observation that's always in the preverbal and subconscious. I'll stop there, but thank you. That's a gift, that insight. All righty.
I listen, thank you so much thank you so much, Craig, for being vulnerable, because I do believe in order to kind of break the curse, the chain moving forward. I mean, Becky can testify for this. You know, I've had conversation with her. We're involved in a project, by the way, Arts Arcade, which is not something that I've spoken about too much, but essentially this work is taking me to a new avenue of my work that I've never been to before. And attached to the excitement that's naturally there because it's new, it's innovative. We're really working with really influential people. It's also stretching me because actually it's forcing me to face everything that I realized was starting to be embedded in me. So sometimes my personal challenge is that I'm very cautious about how excited I get, because I also know that behind that excitement, there's a lot of baggage attached to it. And that can sometimes be quite, what that can potentially do for me is present a level of isolation, because I feel like, well, I want to be as excited as everyone around me, and I am excited, but I also know that coming with that is these sorts of things. And again, I'm putting it out there only to say, to encourage people to feel okay to reflect on that level if you want to. This is where we're going, okay? This is not necessarily about the academia. This is about our personal understanding and relationship. And I think that's a very important part of the process when we're exploring the other sessions that are to come, because you almost have to know where you're at to then understand how this informs the perspectives that you may share within the other aspects of finance and well-being. So yeah, at this point, anybody that feels they want to say something, type something, feel free to jump in.
I'll jump in. I mean, I stuck my camera on because I was really conscious that Craig had done apologising for speaking, but Craig, Alex, between you, your conversation's been really helpful, and you know, it's just so good to listen to. So thank you so much. I thought one thing that you said there was about that challenge of asking for money, which I absolutely relate to. I can relate to so much of what you've both been saying. I think there's also that other end, though, of risking money. So always having to have that last bit in my pocket, you know, I've got to hold something back and can't risk it and invest in something, whether that's investing in myself or investing in my children or something bigger. Having that last bit of money as well, I think,
Yes.
that other end to what you're saying, asking for it, but also spending that last little bit. I think that's been quite crucial for me anyway. Don't know about yourself.
Yes, no, thank you, Karen. And so, Karen, would you say, is that something you learned from adults around you, or is that something you just observed from others, just from looking around?
Absolutely, from learning it from adults, absolutely learning it.
Wow. And I guess if I can maybe press on what you've just said there, and again, thanks for your contribution. I don't want to, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I will say, is there when was the point that you realized that you had that mindset? Is there a moment of, say, something in your professional space where you were like, oh, this is how I think like?
No, I think it was more going out to a bigger audience, a bigger group of people, going to university, for example, and seeing that other people didn't behave like that.
Right.
Isn't that odd?
Right. Yes.
Get into debt? What?
Yes. Isn't it funny that it does take you almost have to go away from your home? I mean, I guess it's obvious, but then at the same time, when you actually think about that, it really is quite profound that you actually have to go away from your everyday being to begin to realize, oh, this is what I actually carry with me.
Yeah, and see how other people work, see how other people do it.
100%. Okay, so let me throw in another question then. It says here, can you identify any cultural impacts on your view and your relationship with money? So again, I'll give you an example of what that might mean. Coming from a Caribbean family, one of the things that my parents often spoke about with their friends whenever they would come together, there was always debates around the politics. And there was always this sense that my parents, their friends, people from the Caribbean community were always discontent with the direction of politics, discontent with the finance, never really satisfied. There's always something. And again, I'm saying that not from a sense of judgment, because actually I understand it. And we understand if we talk about other kind of topics that are aligned with this, racism or other sorts of impacts on the community. But I guess how that impacted me is this sense of survival, threat. I'm always in a constant space of threat because these people are not here for us. They don't like us. You've got to be careful. So there was never any moment where I was able to sit in this sense of abundance. I was always on the edge. Anybody want to jump in there?
I'll just use one word: scarcity.
Okay, boom. There you go. Thank you, Craig. And I've seen a message here from Marianne that says, I'm here with you, relating to your experiences. I like to stay silent if that's okay. Oh, big yourself up from Budapest. Thank you, Marianne. I appreciate that. I've been to Budapest, by the way, and I loved it. Just want to throw that in there. Yeah, anybody else like to throw in anything else like that?
So Alex, and again, here I am, right? Becky, you know me.
Yeah, I love it.
So here's a really daunting implication that comes up here. So we're talking here about our relationship with money, how we've learned it from those around us that loved, cared for, and raised us, who learned it from a larger system who did not love, care, or necessarily want to see us raised, right?
Sure.
But that's kind of right. But who now are parents and grandparents. I mean, I'm the grandparent, not the rest of you. Okay. And knowing that we have subtly, unintentionally given this to our children now as a legacy. And the question becomes, how do we in some way short circuit or minimize or balance? I don't think that, well, it's too late to entirely take it out.
Yeah.
But how do we alter it, redirect it, model differently so that we lessen the generational carryover? I don't think we can answer this today, but I just want to put it out there because I think this is a part of what we have to consciously work on. If we're not consciously working on it, then the subconscious default outcome is that we get another generation that relates to money in the same ways that we relate to money. And I'll stop right there.
Yeah, no, again, once again, thank you so much for sharing, Craig. And it's a great question, because I see, as you speak, I see there's two obvious levels to this. Because there's the first level of realizing that this has impacted you, and your views and your outlook on finance is shaped in a particular way. But then the next one is having the resources to then be able to create the change or to foster the change. And for many of us, when you begin to realize, okay, this is what's happened to me, or this is how I'm shaped, or maybe these sets of behaviors isn't serving me, the question now is, where do I now go? And for many of us within our social circles, we may have the type of friends that we can begin to talk about this, but we may not have the type of people that can begin to help shape us in that sort of way. So now we start talking about your friendship circles, maybe the sort of work that we do maybe enables us or doesn't enable us to be able to have those newer conversations. So I guess it does. It's, as you've said, how, what's next? And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts around that. How do you break a cycle that you begin to recognize within a family circuit is existing?
I can not speak directly to it, but I can comment kind of beside it. And Craig, going back to what you said, like so many important things, but 90% is nonverbal. And I think, like, I have a young daughter who's now asking questions about money, and it's a very binary, polarized kind of like, money does this, money does that, because she's young and she's learning. But I remember another child was walking near, and she had injured herself slightly. And I said, "Oh, you poor thing." And her response was, "I'm not poor." And I was like, wow. And I'm like, okay, I meant like, I'm sorry, like you poor thing. But
Yes.
she, yeah, even at a young age, this child just reacted so strongly to the word poor. So yeah, I think for me, I can say that, like, starting to speak, communicate, but it's so hard to talk about, you know, not having money, attaining money, losing money, all the being social with money, being safe with money. It's like, it's so hard, but I feel like somehow communication through words, you know, is one aspect where we can really kind of sit down and start that conversation really early on. And then, of course, like modeling behavior. I never thought I would be self-employed. I just thought, like, that's just way too risky. I'm just going to be in an academic bubble for my whole life and not get research grants, but somehow just survive. And yet I found myself following in my dad's shoes. And I think part of his kind of like ADHD, this esqueness, gave him bravery and gave him like a risk that was intelligent to just try safe paths for new directions. So again, when I speak with my daughter, I want her to think about these risks in safe ways, not to just say, you know, don't do education, go straight into a startup or whatever, you know, but just to kind of just give her examples of different ways of going into the future and the risks of that. Obviously, she's so young, I can't make it really complicated, but yeah, I think, talking from an early age is part of it to change it. Yeah, I don't know, don't have an answer.
Sure. I mean, I'll add to that, Becky, and thank you for that. I think for me, I mean, I don't have any kids, so I know that's not something, that's not a bridge to cross at this moment in time in terms of how do I communicate. But what I will say is, I do remember one time I was working with a young person. At the time, he was young. He was a dancer, wanted to learn a bit more about the style that I do. So he was doing private lessons with me. Now, what he didn't tell me that he came from a very affluent background, and it wasn't till I had to go travel to his place in Reading. And I remember he picked me up at the station and then drove, and then I see the houses are starting to get bigger. So I'm like, okay, where are we going? And then I just see this huge house, and he just pulled into the house, and I'm thinking, I looked at him and I'm like, well, you live here? He's like, yeah. And I was like, oh, okay. So then I was like, okay, this changes everything now. So anyway, we're here, I do the private lesson, and then he was just he was talking to me about, bearing in mind, how old was he then? 18. And I was already in my late 20s. So even then, like, he's a lot younger than me, but he started talking to me about how his dad gave him £10,000 to basically play with, invest in, and just mess around with. And then I was beginning to realize, okay, so he's from a world where, because his family has money, his dad is teaching him how to, responsibility of money. Is like, here is your money. This is what you need to do with it. And if you mess it up, this is down to you, but this is what you're going to do. So I started to, and when I was listening to how he was talking about it, it wasn't even in a boastful way. It was very much like, it was just a thing. So then I was beginning to realize, oh gosh, this is so normalized in his way. And I had to start, and it started to trigger in my head, how do I normalize this in my life? Because at this moment in time, every time, for example, I book a flight to go somewhere, or every time I press the button to book a train ticket, the amount of anxiety that I have on it, I have to think and overthink just to press the pay now button.
Yes.
And that's right, Craig, you hearing me? And so it's like, okay, how do I work through it? This is almost a sort of, now we're going into sort of emotional therapy, like, what's the word, trauma-like behavior, how do we challenge this? Craig, did you want to say something? Because I can see,
Yeah, so, when you were talking about that point, I thought to myself, that's like being given a broom, right? Like if you remember the first chores you were taught as a child. For me, it was empty the trash and sweep the floor.
Right.
But it's almost as if this child's father, not this child, this young man's father gave him $10,000 like a broom and said, I just want you to take this implement and just start playing around with how you use it in a room in order to get dust in one place, and then a dustpan, right?
Yes, yes.
And so I didn't think about how that's like a utilitarian. It's teaching money as a tool, but I'm afraid it's like either I either could never get the broom, right? Then when I got the broom, what did I do with it? I thought that I was to use it like a flying machine, which is right. And I jump off of a ledge with it.
Yes.
I break the broom, I ruin myself. It's like a lack of subtle practice or ongoing practice with small amounts of money.
Yes.
Even if it was like, well, it's $10,000 for him, but that would have been $50 for me, right?
Yes.
Would have taught an ease and a comfort and thanks. Light bulb number 2 for this talk.
I'm here. Listen, I'm hearing you loud and clear. And it's crazy because when you say it that way, I think I probably was the opposite in the sense that I really looked after my stuff. And even up to today, when I buy a pair of shoes, I put it on and then I put it back in the box. But I realize now for that reason, I can still have a pair of shoes looking good for a long time, but actually it's a positive behavior driven by negative perceptions and mentalities. So for example, what I think for me, if we use an analogy of the broom, my thing would have been, I didn't want to use it because I don't want to get the dust on it. And so this is almost like this. So it's not even abundance because I'm not using it for how it's meant to serve me. I'm just afraid that if I lose it, I'm not going to get it again. And I think this was the undertone of mine. So I was the type of person that was good at not spending the money or not letting my money just disappear quickly. But that came from a place of fear. There was no strategy attached to it. So as a young person, that might have given me a little bit of good boy and pat on the back. But actually, as I got into my adult side, this not wanting to spend the money or fear of spending money hasn't served me now.
It made me wonder if there's an element around that, around what you're surrounded by, in terms of, I'm assuming, Alex, you're down in London.
Yes.
It's very different to up here. I'm sorry, I don't know where you are, Craig. But being surrounded by, obviously I've been to London, I know what it's like, and it's very different to other parts of the country where we're surrounded by a lack of hope, a lack of jobs, a lack of any infrastructure. I mean, you've got great public transport down there. Here it takes forever to catch a bus. It's such a different environment to be surrounded by. That in itself impacts on how we start to think about money. If we see that the whole of our environment, there's no money to be had and there's no money being spent, including on us, I think that impacts how we think about money as well, that bigger
Yes.
picture.
Yes, that's a really good point. And actually, I would say, I'm not too sure where you're based, Karen, but one thing I definitely will say is London in many ways is almost like oh, okay, so yeah, Craig, okay, cool, great. London can almost be like a village in many ways. And I'll tell you what I mean by that, especially from a young people's perspective. One thing I found when working in London, especially my part of East London, which is the Docklands, is that young people didn't travel, particularly because during a time when there was a strong culture of postcode wars. So young people didn't want to go in and out. But the other thing as well is depending on, so I'm going to throw in something a little bit side note, but related. I found that a lot of English working class families often didn't travel because a lot of their families were based in that immediate area. And I think the fact that the docks, okay, between Manchester and Liverpool. Okay, I'm hearing you. Because of the nature, the docks and the legacy of the docks, a lot of the families or their aunts, uncles, grandparents, they lived there for a long time. I found Black families, Caribbean families, our families were often spread around a lot more. So because of that, from a young age, I had a good idea of my geography. And I think that's probably the same with Southern Asian families. They also had their families spread around. And so what you tend to find is the sorts of observations I made when visiting small towns around England where people don't see opportunity, therefore, maybe their aspirations are quite low. I saw it in the local areas, especially in more deprived parts of London, because what they do see is skyscrapers being built up around them, but they see a different type of people accessing it. And almost you can walk through, so a young person might walk through, let's just say Fenchurch Street, and immediately pick up, this area is not for me. So now the default is to go back to either sticking with what you know, if that's a family business, or doing what your friends do. Or for many young people, especially in the media area where I live, crime, because that's the only way. Like where I live is next to the Excel building. And on one side of the train track, it's corporations, expansion, rich people not from the area moving in and buying a property. And on our side, it's crime. So for young people, they're saying, well, if I'm going to be anything like them, the only way I can do that is by making money quickly. Crime. So there's that as well to go with it.
I think we've got some new people joining us as well, Alex.
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, hey, Ada, have I pronounced, Adia, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. If not, please forgive me and maybe correct me in the DM how that is. Welcome to the group. And if you've just joined us, we're talking about our relationship with money. So this is a session in just inviting people to be introspective and looking at their relationship with money and how maybe their childhood, how their community, how their life experiences have informed how we view finance today. So just a bit of context. Craig, I know you. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, but it got away from me what I was going to say. So let's carry on.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't make it.
Okay.
Well, just to reiterate, we were just talking about the fact that even in London, even though it's a city of opportunity and there's a lot of things happening, often young people can still be living in village-like and small town-like bubbles because just because of the way London's designed, you can have very rich areas, I wouldn't even necessarily say rich. You have areas where there's businesses happening, people are very aspirational, they're very goal-driven, taking action, they're networking. And then you can be right next to a neighborhood where people see poverty in lots of forms, people are isolated. So one of the things that I've noticed, and again, people can add to this, is in areas where people are a little bit more kind of career driven, more aspirational, understand that world, they understand the power of networking a lot more. What I tend to find in more poorer communities is people stick to their communities very inner from a cultural perspective. So for example, in the area that I live in, the Lithuanian community are very tight knit. The white working class community are very tight knit. The Black Caribbeans are tight knit. It's very much stick within their safety bubbles, which are often driven by culture as opposed to opportunity, where people in those spaces, they almost see opportunity as finding their space and their community.
And then Alice, I want to add to that because so I grew up in Philadelphia here in the United States, and we have a very similar dynamic. Actually, we
Sure.
call ourselves a city of neighborhoods.
Right.
So
Right.
there's a city which is probably more for that's for the government, but we're really a collection of villages, and different villages have different characteristics, and you know which one you belong in,
Yes.
and you know which one. And very often, one of the first steps of being, so with school, there's your neighborhood school, but the families that are aspiring for mobility you get sent to schools outside your neighborhood, which is a major life transition, right?
Yes.
And often for purposes of you specializing to get in an industry, because the family's hope is that we're going to break you out because you're going to get to whatever this other place, this land of Oz, I'll call it, right?
Yes.
That we're all sent to chase after.
Yes.
And so what was the point I was driving to? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Let me just affirm that the point that you bring up about this parochialism is definitely the case. And it does teach us different things about money. A quick personal example. At some earlier point in my life, I had a discussion with this therapist. It was actually a Jungian analyst. And we were reflecting on my life. And she was telling me about how it's really interesting that my life seems to reflect a class stair step, right?
Say that again, sorry?
A class stair step. So she says, it's really curious to me that you were born in this particular neighborhood that was working class. Your dad then worked hard and moved you to a middle-class neighborhood. This is a part of social mobility. Took you out of public schools, sent you to private schools, and all the kind of advantages and pressures that come with that. And she says, interestingly enough, you now live in a neighborhood, which, by the way, is within 5 miles of the neighborhood I was raised in as a child. She said that your parents could never have hoped to have lived in. That is a wealthy neighborhood. And she says, but the problem is that you created a golden cage that you're now trapped in. Right? She says, you constructed this cage to meet the aspirations of your family and to escape your sense of scarcity. But the reason you're here with me now is because you're trapped in that cage and have a great deal of angst, guilt, and constriction that goes with having accomplished that. And then she said, and you're quite normal.
Wow.
As a social.
Oh, I think he stopped in the flow. Is it Craig that's paused? Yeah, okay. Well, hopefully he'll come back. I'm just going to read a private message that's been sent to me. So it says here, thank you for making me think so much on the subject, Alex. I got you, thank you. Been thinking about 2 things. My relationship with money as a woman, I had to practice to get comfortable asking for it and realizing what I deserve. Cultural aspect, and more making money and sharing with your community versus a more Western individual attitude to money. Brilliant. That's really interesting, actually. That relationship between, yes, the Western expectations or the Western way and your kind of community expectations of how that money should be made. And I think there was a conversation around, there was a certain term for this. I don't know if anyone knows the term where they speak about, for some individuals who want to create that wealth or manage to through whatever, changing the way they look at, wealth, or whether it's just opportunities that they've been very persevering on. But when they kind of make it, for some families, for some communities, they then have the responsibility of how they then bring their family into the situation, whereas some others don't have that responsibility. So how do you navigate that? That's really interesting. Thank you for that one. We have another one here that says, Western attitude, meaning making your money for yourself versus your family and giving to the community. Yes. Okay, so hopefully I've I've understood and I've kind of brought that out right. If I have, just give me a quick thumbs up just to make sure I've understood you correctly. But thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that input as well. I'm realizing that we're running short of time, so maybe I'm going to move on with another question. Okay, here is one, and again, I don't know what people's relationship with social media is, so it may be void, but I'll put it out there anyway. What impact has social media had on your views of finance? Or if it has any impact on your views of finance? So for me, for example, I'll probably kick that off and say I'm on Instagram. I've been on Facebook. I was on MySpace and Friends Reunited when they did come out. I think particularly with Facebook and Instagram, what it has done is there is a sense of, I think we're all very aware of this, where people, like a show button culture, where people feel like they need to kind of keep up with letting people know how their life is going, and mostly in a positive perspective. But then you have this culture that I would say in more recent years that have developed, where people kind of present a very positive message, but actually there's an undertone of arrogance and there's an undertone of showboating. So for example, you might hear those kind of presentations like, you've got 24 hours in the day. What are you going to do? Are you going to sleep? Or are you going to get up and work for it? If you don't, or things like, the hustle, you've got to hustle. And often for me personally, because of the type of person I am, I actually find that raises my anxiety, because actually it taps into my sense of inadequacy. It doesn't encourage me. It doesn't inform me in how I move forward, but actually does the complete opposite. It makes me feel almost like, oh, well, if they're doing it, maybe I'm not. So I don't know if anybody has any other thoughts that they want to share about that.
I think with that as well, I think it comes over so individualistic about how wonderful I am and look at all the things I am doing, that it makes me go the opposite way, like yourself, but into thinking, how as a community can we do things? What is our group of people doing, rather than the I all the time?
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that, and I 100% vibe with you there. We've got another message here that says, hey, this is the message has been sent to everyone, so I guess the person is okay with me mentioning your name. It's Adia. I really hope I'm pronouncing the name right, but it says, this is Shubham Chowdhury. I have logged in. Okay, I have logged in with my sister's laptop. Okay, I got you. I'm a student in grade 12, and I'm working on Gen Z mental health issues here in Bangalore, especially after COVID. Oh, brilliant. Okay, well, thank you for being part of the session. And I do hope that there's been a few things, any triggers, positive triggers, or anything that's maybe allowed your thinking to think in a new way. I hope so, but thank you for joining us. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to add to this?
I'll jump into that, because the word that Keith said about community is really important. And this conference, like DIMH, is community building. And like when I started this conference 7 years ago, people kept saying, why don't you charge for it? And it wasn't in me to do that, because I wanted to see what it could look like, a world that didn't have that goal of just making money. Because I feel sometimes when you, and again, this is social media and online kind of stuff, because I guess the reason I'm saying it is because my website, it's getting tons of traffic. I only capture the minimum to know my unique people coming. I don't see where they go, what they do, but it is definitely a safe, sales-free environment, and there's no cost. And just being able to visualize a different future, or a different space, or a place for a community to thrive, online, social media, and, websites and stuff. I think we need to do that more often, just to inspire people to think radically different in healthy ways, that we don't have to be driven by money, and I don't have to put a price tag on this, and I don't have to give a free service and then have like a private premium, exclusive conversation, like the 7 p.m. show with Alex, that kind of stuff, So for me, anyway, I don't want to take up too much time, but yeah, just to say, for me, I get really nervous about taking the monetary side of social media and all that kind of growth. It will change how you think and where you go. So for me, anyway, others, and Craig's back in the room in a minute. There we go.
Excellent. And thank you very much for sharing that, Becky. And I see that Glenn, you've been waiting patiently to say something. Welcome, Glenn.
Hi, Alex. Thank you. Thank you for the great chat. I'm not terribly active on social media, but I remember seeing something in a newspaper recently. I'm not sure if it was a local one here in Australia or the New York Times, but the article was about how social media and particularly TikTok had been used to spread advice to young people on financial literacy. And there were some very active people sort of in that space trying to educate and I guess raise people's skills, even concepts like compounding interest, which is, a very important sort of principle. So I guess I was just thinking about social media as a source of good and spreading messages, particularly to young people who may not otherwise have access or as much access in their community or around them, around savings and looking after their financial sort of well-being. So I just wanted to add that into the mix.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that's very important. And I think to add to that as well, I mean, I have noticed that, and what it does do is that there is conversations that, say, the current generation are having around money that we just never would have even dreamt of having. Terms, certain awareness that you can see it's happening at a younger age. So absolutely, I definitely agree with you on that as well. Thanks for that contribution. I've just seen welcome back to Craig. Yeah, we lost you. We saw that when you held that pose. I was thinking, is this turning into a street dance conference? But luckily it was just the one person. So I thought, okay, that's cool. I recognize we've only got a couple of minutes. And so is there any particular thoughts that people may have, or any closing remarks or any final thoughts that people, or if someone, for example, has just been listening in, is there any immediate takeaway points that people might just want to throw in the DMs to let me know what people are taking away? And Craig says something about, are you familiar with the Prosperity Project? But no, I'm not actually. Do you wanna share that, Craig? Uh-oh.
Yeah, so, and I'm going to put the link in the chat actually. So
Wicked.
this is a project that operates here in the United States, and I think you have similar here in the UK, of a nonprofit that is actually working with young people. You know, in the US, we've got this dilemma with student debt. And unfortunately, this dilemma is actually leading to this. I don't know if you've ever heard of financially induced suicide.
Yep.
Right? Okay. So this nonprofit is actually setting up educational programs to work with young people who find themselves in this vexing type of debt. And so I just bring it up because it gets at how we use, I'm going to call it educational, if not digital innovation and technology, as a way of helping, well, citizens in general, right? With understanding these types of attitudes. I want to tell you, just what we talked about today has been healing for me. This has been therapy. Just those two insights, right?
Yeah.
That I need to now go back and do more reflection on.
Yeah.